before we begin the formal part of this, one of the things that we must do as an act of not only our individual sovereignties as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but is to acknowledge the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people of the Kulin Nations on lands who not only do we meet and gather, but on whose lands we live our lives. And those lives are inextricably linked to their never cession of their sovereignty, and how do we get reminded of that as a matter of practice in the everyday. So I acknowledge the Bunurong and the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, their elders past, present and emerging.
Great. So I thought maybe we'd start with quick introductions of ourselves. My name's Crystal McKinnon. I'm the Vice-Chancellor's Indigenous Research Fellow at RMIT, and I'm a Yamatji woman. I've been living on the Kulin Nations land for about 15 years.
And I'm Mark McMillan. I am a Wiradjuri man from Trangie in central New South Wales, and I'm the Deputy Pro-Vice-Chancellor of Indigenous Education and Engagement and Professor of Law at RMIT University.
My name's Maryrose Casey, and I'm a white Australian, Irish migrants, and I have lived on Kulin Nations pretty much most of my life, except when I've spent time in Gurrunpul land. And I'm an Associate Professor in Indigenous Studies at Monash University.
So thank you all for being here. Our chair had to cancel at the last minute due to some health reasons, so we're facilitating ourselves.
This will be interesting.
So we'll do our best to, keep it tight, self-regulate, So I thought we'd just tell you a couple of the themes that we came up with that we wanted to talk about, and we'll discuss those for the first half of the session, and then for the second half we'll open it up to questions so you guys can interact and ask us what you want to know, or want to discuss, should I say. So the themes that we thought we'd talk about was a discussion about the performativity of Aboriginality as a race and the dimensions within that. And we wanted to talk about how racism has been entrenched in Australian society. And also, given that it's so entrenched, what can people do to challenge this? And how do we work towards creating a shared and more just future based on Indigenous sovereignties and not racialised logics? So in regards to the performativity of Aboriginality as a race.
Because I think Maryrose would be the best to step in here, because this is not just your academic work, this is your lived experience. So you have a better idea of how we as Aboriginal people have been required to perform since the colonial encounter. So you might want to take us through that.
Most of my work, all of my work really, is about a desperate desire to understand Australian racism, particularly in terms of the embodied encounter, people in front of each other and how they deal. And that has led to me spending an awful lot of time looking at the inauthenticity of notions of authenticity. I mean, you can have an authentic artefact, but how do you make a person like an artefact? But ever since Australian settlement, or pretty much certainly by the beginning of 1800, people were already, white settlers, colonists, were already declaring Aboriginal people authentic or inauthentic. Basically, anybody who lived within the settlement, like somebody like Bungaree, who refused to leave his land and lived on what is now Domain Park, or what's
near the
Domain,
New South Wales
basically in Sydney, and lived there all his life, was not authentic when he was within the settlement. And then they were horrified because he could sit down to dinner with the governor wearing a full suit, and then he'd strip it all off when he went home, and outside when he was dealing with communities. He would just not bother with European clothes. So from that very early stage, people are already saying, this person is authentic, this person is inauthentic. And it's always on the same sort of terminology. If you live here, you're inauthentic. If you live somewhere else, you're authentic. And I'm sorry, this is my soapbox. The words haven't changed much. When Andrew Bolt was attacking people as inauthentic, yes, he was saying they were fair-skinned. But that's a very minor change. Everything else is almost word for word the same. If you can, and a study they did of the land rights in Northern Territory found that basically judges would decide somebody was inauthentic if they could speak English, if they weren't black enough, and if they understood where they were. And considering from first settlement, Aboriginal people have learnt how to deal with Europeans and European laws, European courts, to say that anybody who understands it is therefore inauthentic comes back to a very basic part of the imperial enterprise, which is to say if people don't die out or disappear, then they have to be erased in another way. And I'm really going on, so you're going to add in?
Well, I think that's... that inextricable link between Aboriginality and blackness is still haunting us all, because it is about one of the mechanisms of authentication, as you said, is blackness itself. And what is under contestation is the performance of blackness now just as not as an embodied experience, but one as an accepted rationale that blackness is only predicated on the colour of your skin. And I think what has really confused this has been what is the new black in Australia, as it disassociates what is the old black. Because until after the emancipation of whiteness after the post-white Australia policy, blackness took on a whole different meaning through immigration. And then so that then has confused, well, what was before immigration and blackness, which was then to be Aboriginal. So when we think of racialised constructions in Australia, up until 1967 or around that, it only existed through Aboriginality. But then with migration and refugee flows, that contestation has actually emerged as something that's displacing what the original black is. And I think that's where you get people like Andrew Bolt being able to step into that as a discussion point of saying, well, Aboriginality is actually, it's really important to us that then it's centred around people's colour of the skin. And if you don't know, I was one of those people that Andrew Bolt came after. And I was one of those people that responded through the federal court. I was one of the 9 that with Anipat Etok, we said enough's enough, like this isn't about blackness at all. So what we were doing in that case was trying to disassociate race and Aboriginality with blackness, because that's taken its own turn. And yet that's where we're always required to perform, right? Yeah, we've even got the phenomenon in our own communities and people do this all the time as a matter of authentication. I lovingly refer to it as a lot of people fly over the brown people to get to the black people as a matter of authenticating where Aboriginality truly and authentically exists. Oh, we went out to Mildura. It's like, for fuck's sake, Kulin are authentically the sovereigns of this place. Why is it that we actually have to say we need to go and have a black experience somewhere else when in fact it's pervasive here? So how do we start to have those conversations about the performance of who we can be as Aboriginal people? Yeah,
and like you were saying, Aboriginal people are always over there and we're here. It's always this separation of distance and in opposition, like, you know, urban versus rural, all of those things.
And temporality becomes important, right? Because it's like blackness wasn't created in 1788. It was a marker in 1788 of you're not white. So I think what we're all struggling with is what was before race? What was before in this place before 1788? And so you're starting to actually go, we're Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and our allies and supporters are constantly being called on to justify why we're not something rather than how do we actually perform to, we don't have to care what you think. And really that was the point of, that was our counter performance in the Andrew Bolt stuff. That was why we did it. It wasn't for any other reason than to stop people requiring us to perform to blackness when there is a physical incapacity to have that level of performance. But then it's what do people insured into that?
And it speaks to the entrenchment of these ideas, you know, that they're constantly imposed on our community and we constantly have to grapple with those and either fight them or figure those things out and whatever else. But yeah, it speaks to the entrenchment, I think.
And it's also gives a great deal of power to the erasure of knowledge about Aboriginal people. The way every time you turn around, suddenly everything that has existed before, and in cross-cultural relations, not just within Aboriginal communities, oh no, none of that ever happened. And that ignorance constantly feeds a particular expectation of people. You never actually have to find out, what is Aboriginal practice or culture or life or who. It's always something beyond knowing or finding out about, which, I think is the really critical thing to change that level of knowledge, that lack of knowledge, and that lack of acceptance of human beings are different and also the same.
I think the modernity is actually required, or certainly post that, who gets to have empathy with Aboriginal people as a site of being othered. And that's an interesting turn of itself. Where do we as humans have empathetic connections to Aboriginality and Indigenous sovereignty in ways that I think, as a maturing of the Australian nation and certainly the national identity as a truly multicultural identity, where does indigeneity fit with that? And I think there's a real challenge for all Australians, not for blackfellas, as in for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, but for all others to say, why does Aboriginality matter differently to the national narrative than just mere multiculturalism and cultural empathy? And I think that's a real big challenge, because it's, as we all know, it's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who get burdened with trying to explain to everybody else what it is, because we want to say that there's not a binary of multiculturalism. Means that there's no binary, there's no just black and white. Yet for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians, there is literally just that binary. You're either Aboriginal or you're not. And that's just not a construction of law, which it is, but it's also a construction of our sovereign ways of organising as distinct peoples. You're either Wiradjuri or you're not. And it doesn't mean that's exclusionary. It just means that your ontological connections become grounded in a particular way of knowing the world, of which there can be just that worldview or there isn't. And those that are fortunate of us in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities that are multicultural in that Indigenous identity. Because of forced migration of Aboriginal peoples onto missions such as Cummeragunja, Lake Tyers, Corranderk itself, and the missions in New South Wales, Queensland and other places, you actually had then a coming together of sovereignties. So we do have a lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are more than one sovereign in that way. But we're also Australian too. So I think I've confused people. But where I go with that is, it is our challenge to try to say to people who are not white in Australia, how do we form a particular way of knowing each other that's not predicated on whiteness, but it's predicated on something else, but it can't be equal, because we need to construct that solidarity in ways that grounds Indigenous sovereignty as the way of being.
Yeah, the thing I think that the settlers, have in common is that they need to grant Indigenous sovereignty first in terms of how they relate to being in Australia. And then from there, I think that whether you're a migrant background or convict background or recent migrant or refugee, that's then constructed in different ways about how you relate and how you deal with and creating a more just world.
But I think it's a really critical thing, that lumping of Indigenous people under the heading of multicultural is another form of erasure.
Yeah, and assimilation, yeah, and not recognising the differences within all of our communities from, west to east, south to north, yeah.
I think those things about how it's allowed to become entrenched is something that we are all struggling with. Who in this room has heard about constitutional recognition? So you probably have a view and an interest. But how do we start to actually unpack why it is that Aboriginal people, we were not allowed to be in the construction of race up until 1967. And then post-1967, non-Indigenous people and governments demand that we be included in race and then legislated the shit out of us. But when we talk about constitutional recognition, people are just seeing it as the cultural, oh, it's the right time, rather than actually go, well, really, what is the question here is how does Aboriginality sit now within the construction of Australia, but what has been the practices of all Australians of the 100 and something years of not existing in that as a racialised construction. When we think of federation, we think of the whole point of the Australian, the Australian Federation in 1901 wasn't the creation of a nation with a distinct identity. It was to liberalise trade and commerce amongst the colonies. And so then in the 1890s, and this is where your work is really important, Maryrose, there were performances of Aboriginality because the central tenet of the Federation itself was the eradication of Aboriginal people. So there's a reason, there's two things that Australia did that entrenched a way of knowing race and therefore a way of enacting race in Australia was, if you're white, you're fine. If you are Chinese or Afghani, we're going to create a whole separate section in the Constitution called the Races Power, of which we're not going to put Aboriginal people in those racialised constructions because the job of the states was to kill us off. Hence we had half-caste acts, hence we had protection. But what you did in your work around the 1890s was how did Aboriginal people, we start to actually reference that back as a matter of performance and how people would pay to see the Aborigines whilst at the same time knowing that they were trying to eradicate. So it was but those behaviours, those ways of being, that's where the erasure has occurred to me. So when we race towards this constitutional recognition, which, I'm not a fan of, because recognising what? To the fact that if you think about, are we recognised in words, that's fine. We can do that easily. But it's recognising the intent of why you want us in there that needs the overhaul. So we will... I think that because we try to work out why is this so pervasive and who has to suffer it, right? Because it seems to be it's everywhere. And then you get these little spikes of, well, now you sort of, dance for me, Aborigine, as to what that kind of means.
Why don't you want what we're giving you?
Yeah, and you should be grateful.
Yeah.
People actually say that about all sorts of things. I mean, that happens a lot with the football. If there is any objection to racism in football, then there's actually blogs that discuss the fact that Aboriginal people should be grateful to be allowed to play football. This crazy
the
stuff.
irony of Mangrook and the AFL, I tell you, it's a little bit mental.
But I think it all comes back to this. That embedded erasure is part of the reason why racism is so pervasive in Australia. Because if they're not there, then you're not racist.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, to talk about the performance. It goes back. There's a whole lot of traditions for entertainment in traditional Aboriginal society. About 200 different genres that I found, and they're all just if you haven't got ceremony, if you don't have to get anything, people put on a performance for each other. And a lot of the early cross-cultural exchanges were Aboriginal people claiming territory and doing performances largely for entertainment. But there's another level on which it's also saying it's our land and an offer of information exchange. But just to give you an example of one that I'm looking at for this conference we're going to in the next minute.
Next minute?
1847... there was a major shipwreck of a steamer off the coast of Stradbroke Island in Moreton Bay in Queensland. And the only people who survived, a group of Aboriginal men from Stradbroke actually swam out through the storm and brought people in. and only those that they brought in survived. A lot of people died. It was considered a very serious event. 3 months later, a group of Aboriginal men from Stradbroke came and performed with, I think, the Turrbal from that area, actually performed a dramatic... now, performances get underrated a lot, Aboriginal performances, because it's dance, it's song, it's dialogue, it's poetry, it's props, it's everything under the sun. So in the middle of, or on the edge of, at Kangaroo Point, if you know Brisbane, just on the edge of what was then the major sort of settlement, they performed the sinking of the Sovereign and the rescue by Aboriginal people of the survivors. Now, you can sort of, and what has happened for a long time is to erase that and say, oh, it's oral history. Well, their performances weren't oral history, they were for entertainment. But you think about it, if there's been whether it's a 9/11 or something, and then somebody who had a critical part in saving people, and you say no longer exists, comes and performs that for you on your doorstep, what are they saying? What are they trying to get you to look at?
Yeah, it's a deliberate amnesia, I think, of Australian society as well. You know, like this really deliberate, we think you're this and this is what you are and you can't exist outside of that. So despite all of the evidence, despite, you know, everything to the contrary, it'll always be that Aboriginal people are only oral, you know, only know knowledge in certain ways, can only live in certain places and all of the rest of it. It's just the really deliberate erasure and deliberate boxing that we contend with.
And I think that bicultural exchange, I think we've got to really start to understand what sits beneath it. It's actually knowledge that's predicated on thousands and thousands and thousands of years of experience with place. So when you might see it as entertainment, or a non-Indigenous person might see something as a performance, and we offer it up as a performance. But actually think about what is the role of any performance in any society, not just an ancient society or in air quotes, civilised society. It is about the prosecution of how the world is known. And so when we think of what they were performing, it wasn't just to entertain. It was actually to state as a matter of sovereignty their place in an event that shapes that society. So when we think of writing letters to missions and all of that sort of stuff, and, you know, Crystal and I are involved in an ARC project on how do we take letters written to missionaries as a demand and as a conduct of lawful relations between sovereigns and see it through that lens rather than seeing it was a mere response to I need more blankets or I need to exist. So there's got to be a sort of a shape shift in how non-Indigenous people can receive knowledges of indigeneity itself and how knowledge is actually transferred. And one of the mechanisms is performance. Ceremony isn't just gobbledygook. It is actually an expression and an activity of sovereignty itself, which is to stabilise the society. So, because that's what our knowledges do for us, right? You know, in non-Indigenous societies, knowledge actually forms the basis of the sustainability and stabilisation of the society itself. Why is that any different to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and sovereigns? Yet we construct it in such a way that it's different. When in fact, if you actually go with the logics of it, we've been doing it in this place for 70,000 years. So when we think of sustainability of society and temporality, so are we in trouble already? We didn't say anything wrong yet. We've got to actually go, that was how we, for us, undertake the activities of our own sovereignty. It's not always for the benefit of the recipient. And so we've got to get away from how we construct these things, not so much of who's saying it, but how to hear it, how to see it, and how to feel it. And that shouldn't be the burden of us as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to put that out. I think that's a social skill that all of us living in this place need to be able to do a little bit better.
Cool. We might open it up for questions.
Don't pick her.
There's some ushers. We're under strict instructions to let the ushers
ask questions.
Choose. There's some coming down now.
Hello, beautiful panel. I have a comment and a question, I suppose. My comment is completely unrelated to my question, and I'm sorry, but I'm going to do it anyway. But I find it really startling that the previous panel that we had was all people of colour, talking about people of colour issues, and yet we come to the only panel discussing Indigenous issues, and yet it is not staffed by purely Indigenous people. To me, this is another comment about how, in order for our Aboriginality to be legitimate, we need to have someone who is non-Indigenous be present with us. So I'd like to make my feelings about that known. But the question I wanted to ask, actually, Mark, because you speak so beautifully on it, is can you tell us what you define, and the panel, but what you define sovereignty as to be, and how non-Indigenous people can support Indigenous people in enacting our sovereignty?
It's a great question, but I'd like to deal with the...
comment.
The comment, yes. It's really important that we are now in sovereign relationships. So as we explain how those sovereign relationships and what is the basis of that, it is how do we also do all this in conversation. It's not now a matter of just blackfellas, we've worked out what it is, but it's really important that as we do this publicly, the shared future is about the future of all of us. And so how do we construct ways that can be known in not just how we do things publicly, but it's vital that we have non-Indigenous people who not only know of us, but know themselves well enough to actually participate in the conversation as instruction. So you've had your comment, my comment was back, and I think they're really important things to know, that Aboriginal sovereignty is predicated on who can we welcome to be here as their home. So when we think of what the elders do as part of their sovereignty in doing a welcome to country, it's not merely just to exist here for a period of time. When you speak to Auntie Carolyn and Auntie Di, who are our elders in residence, one of the things that they are very clear with us is what the invitation do is the proper construction of what should have happened 240 years ago, which is to be invited to actually call this home and to therefore allowed to be emote that this is home. I think non-Indigenous Australians, to be fair, have been socially manipulated into fearing that they are not legitimately home. So it is the proper place of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to actually ground people's ability to call this home permanently, but it's constructed through the eyes of Indigenous sovereignty and through the lens of Indigenous sovereignty and through the practices of Indigenous sovereignty. So it's very important, for me anyway, that we actually do this in a relational context. I've been on all Indigenous panels, and I've been on blended panels, and I've been on panels where you're the only Indigenous voice. This was, so we were asked by Wheeler Centre who we'd like on the panel. I could have gone down and said it's an all-Indigenous panel, but that would miss the point about what is a sovereign relationship and how it gets constructed. So what is Aboriginal sovereignty? Aboriginal sovereignty is certainly what was and has always been our authority to speak and as country, to construct Aboriginal sovereignty of there was a before. And so sovereignty are those, for me, those things that allows us to have our connections to place, have the authority, not because white people say we have it, it has always been. So those abilities to acknowledge, welcome, know country, care for country, but also the authority to regulate how things actually are on country.
I'll speak to the support part that you mentioned. To my, for instance, at the moment we've got treaty discussions going on in the state now known as Victoria. I think one of the important things that we can do is support local communities in those discussions and support them to be empowered in order to attend discussions about this, the support of someone's sovereignty is about supporting their demands and what they want, I think. And my responsibility as an Indigenous person not from here, from Western Australia, is to have a relationship with the elders here and know what the community wants and ask them what they want. And Mark's right in terms of discussing some of the elders that we are in conversation with every day about the things the way that they see their sovereignty enacted, and that's how we support what goes on in Naarm.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. That's a difficult thing to actually keep in mind, which is as people not of Kulin, as Aboriginal, as a Wiradjuri person, if I don't actually go and funnel everything that I do through Kulin, their ongoing acceptance and judgment, because my welcome onto this country is equally as conditional as a non-Indigenous person's. It's just a different way.
There's a welcome and a refusal. Like the welcome's not mandatory. That's not what we're saying. Like there's also the right of refusal, and it's important to us that we're accepted to be here, and to get that acceptance. But
which it goes to our conduct. And who has the legitimate... So it goes to the sovereignty question. Who gets to authenticate conduct of sovereignty on territory? And so the conduct, the lawful conduct that we get engaged with the elders, because that's also providing a link back to our places, so is forever in judgment. And I think that's the right place to be. I'm not uncomfortable with that. In fact, it actually guides my behaviours. And then hopefully it guides how other people can be with Kulin sovereignty as a practice of every moment of every day. It's not going out and having to talk to a blackfella every day. It's about that internalised I am on, and how does that support the grounding of other people. So really it's the practice of sovereignty that sits, of Indigenous sovereignty that sits with everybody else who is not from here, that allows them to be grounded, but that grounding's in Indigenous sovereignties and ways of being with place that is conditional.
Next question.
Hi. Well, you've pretty much answered my question, which is really fascinating. But one of the issues that I struggle with is that notion of gratitude that you spoke about earlier. That if I question this society or I question what's around me, how dare I? I should be so grateful to be here. I should be so grateful to be in this space, right? And I find that so problematic because you have every right to be wherever you are. And if you're not happy, you've got every right to stand your ground and to say it. So I don't understand, I guess culturally I don't understand where this notion that you should pay homage to, or be grateful to standing in the space even comes from. I don't have that culturally. And that even if I did have that, I would want to ask the original people of the land for that privilege, as opposed to the gatekeepers that are telling me I don't have a right to speak because I should be so grateful to be standing in this space. I don't get to be a whole human with a voice. But that was what I wanted to discuss and maybe have a little bit more clarification about it because it's so culturally different for me, that attitude. But you did cover a lot of that in answering the last question, but if you can elaborate more, that would be wonderful.
So I don't think everybody has the right to speak.
Yeah.
I don't. I think that this whole right to an opinion on different issues that you don't have a background in or you're not from that community, I don't think you necessarily have a right to speak. I don't believe that's an absolute, but I'm not sure.
I think what you're asking is how do we get around not just the gatekeepers, but how does that authentication of having the right to speak, because that comes with being sufficiently grounded in not just the right, but is actually it's in the capacity to say I can speak and what's the true, how would you actually have that manifest? And you're absolutely right. I mean, whether it's where in North America, there's particular constructions of the way that racialised logic plays out and where does that fit with Indigenous sovereignties. I think in Australia we're still struggling with, well, sovereignty and race are not as they are in North America. They're actually inextricably linked here. And that idea of who is free to speak, I mean, you know, it doesn't get much more obvious when you come up with the likes of Andrew Bolt, and everything is about freedom of speech and the right to speak and the right to association. I think what that's trying to do, and I don't want to confuse this, but I think I might right now, the human rights agenda, or the rights of humans in our human rights framework, is something new. Civil rights, human rights, it's something that we're all still trying to figure out. Where does the principles of human rights, which is to be free from discrimination, to live with equality and dignity, how does that actually start to manifest physically in a place where it did not, Australia, I'm talking about Australia, where Australia denied purposefully a proper construction of the relationships of being with this place. So had we done what happened in North America, whether it's treaties or whether it's even the US Constitution itself, deals with Native Americans in a particular way that actually gave you an indicator or a signifier of who should you be speaking to, and where do those rights then attend. In Australia, that didn't occur. So human rights have emerged, and people, so post the Second World War, and rightfully so, in a way that, and then we still denied, even though there was human rights evolution and emergence, there was still the structural denial of Indigenous sovereignty and a requirement to have a relationship, not the state to have a relationship, but for the people of this place, all other Australians, to have a relationship with Aboriginal people as well. And that is really what has happened in the last 25 years. In 1992, our equivalent of the Supreme Court, the High Court, ruled that the doctrine, the mode of acquisition of Australia, which denied Aboriginal existence, full stop, for the purposes of applying laws and not incorporating Indigenous sovereignty into that new world, went on for 204 years, up until 1992, and then they said, we can't do this anymore. So in the place of the doctrine of terra nullius, or that ongoing denial of a relationship with us, came this requirement to be in relation. So that's where we start to go, this is why it's starting to matter to all Australians as to why should Aboriginal people matter now? Well, it matters because the nation's identity is now inculcated with a relationship of not just First Peoples, but all peoples here, that is predicated on that relationship with what was and has always been. So I think it's just trying to work through that, and I think I think your question is still valid. It's actually trying to work that through with non-Indigenous people as Aboriginal people, to actually get the right set of constructions, and so you can unpack not just whiteness, but you can unpack non-Indigeneity and then rebuild it in a relational context that society itself is demanding. So I'm not sure that was helpful, but yeah. It's so interesting. God, that was shit, but at least I know more.
Somebody used an expression before, racialised logic, and I find it really interesting. I was thinking that I guess it's something that the settlers brought to Australia, the capacity for racialised logic, and then set about entrenching that as they built the nation, and so that we all end up thinking certain ways. And it seems logical, even though it's incredibly racist. I just wondered if somebody could talk more about racialised logic and how it connects to Australia's history and identity.
That's everything.
Like the logics of terra nullius, for instance, or the logics of...
Aileen's book on possessive... what's it called?
The white possessive.
The white possessive. Aileen Morton Robinson has written a very interesting book that brings together a whole lot of essays that looks at the ways in which those logics of whiteness operate in Australia and have for a long time. Would you recommend something else?
There's so much. It's also tied to sort of things like critical whiteness studies, Fiona Nichols' work.
Yeah.
But racialised logics are basically what is rendered invisible, how the constructions of race, how they're pervasive. So like we've talked about, there's you can't construct Aboriginality in Australia without thinking it through racialised logics. It's an impossibility, which is why what was before race, and what is still independent of race, is Indigenous sovereignty itself. But making those links, I think there's a whole body of work. I mean, it's not just Australian authors too. There's a whole body internationally. Where I think Aileen Morton Robinson's work is becoming much more prevalent is bringing into a clear focus is race or critical race, whiteness and indigeneity into a very clear focus. But there's work out of UCLA with Cheryl Harris, Kimberly Crenshaw, all of these people. And because what we can do in Australia is we might have a different way of using African American and civil rights and the racialised logics that fit through that. Where that starts to get a little bit tricky is where it starts then to intersect with indigeneity, and that's the emergent work that Cheryl Harris and Devon Cadoba and Audra Simpson. Oh, there's a whole lot of, there's a whole lot of theorists that are trying to unpack it but then reconstruct these things as linked. And I think where Aileen's work or Professor Morton Robinson's work becomes vital is in through that white possessive, because it actually gives the account of that. Of particular note, her seminal work, Talking Up to the White Woman, is really useful also in exploring that through feminist ideals.
Any more questions?
We've got 14 minutes.
Comments? Oh, there's a...
No, there's one just down there and then up here.
Just the last theme that you said you were going to discuss, I'd love to hear a bit more about that, but I can't quite remember what it was. But when you mentioned the themes you were going to discuss at the start.
The shared futures.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, as I said, I kind of touched on it before, but I think it's important for people to know where they are and their place and what that community is striving for and desires. You know, I think I saw a panel a couple of weeks ago where a question was asked about treaty of an Indigenous person living off country, living here, and they said, "Oh, you know, I'm not interested in treaty." Like, I think it's our duty and our obligation to be interested in these conversations, because this is what the communities that we're living in are fighting for. Like, this is their practice of their sovereignty. You know, this is, you know, what these communities want, and we should be supporting them as Indigenous people off our own countries, and also as non-Indigenous migrants or settlers or however people want to self-describe. Like, I think it's our duty and obligation to know what communities are striving for and be informed about it, and, you know, support in the ways that we can, for instance. And, you know, that's supporting the creation of a more just future, in my opinion.
But I think that from all sorts of points of view, that the more we can learn about what is actually operating, how we are part of it. I mean, I would suggest that racism is not an Indigenous problem, it's everybody's problem. And because of that, we are all implicated and we are all doing things on a daily basis that further entrenched problems. And the only way we discover that is by more information, more conversation, more exchange, and curiosity about what's happening.
I think for me is how do we construct a different future, one that is secure, that we're not going to keep going on with, I think that discomfort of, are non-Indigenous Australians legitimately here? So how do we construct that shared future? And we talk through that lens of, well, if we are all accepting that the future is one of shared. So when we think of what the shared past has been, you don't have to think very hard, because there was no possibility of having a shared past because, from an Aboriginal perspective, because the past has been about erasure, assimilation and genocide. There was, and I'm not saying that to be emotive, I'm saying that as a factual basis. You know, report after report. And if anybody's seen Professor Larissa Berrent's new movie, After the Apology, we are barrelling towards another cataclysmic schism in Aboriginal worldviews and Aboriginal families. If we don't act now as a nation, there are more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, young people, children being put into out-of-home care. At this rate, by 2025, we will have more Aboriginal people living away from their families, their communities and their sovereignty than during the whole Stolen Generations period and era. So when we think of the past, we go, it wasn't one that was shared. So what do we think about when we talk about a shared future? And that also is inculcated in what is the Australian narrative. Why do we matter to you? Because for 204 years we were told we weren't to matter to you. Now we're just a wicked problem that we need to solve. Now we need to get our gaps closed. And I'm sorry, my gap's all right. Don't need it closed much. But the point is, how do we start to imagine a sovereign future? All of us. That is predicated on what has always been, which is Indigenous sovereignty. So if we think of anybody who knows Foley, anybody who knows the work of Indigenous activism, not just recently, but from the moment of encounter, has always been, we never ceded our sovereignty. It's not a political statement. It's not a political slogan. It is a legal question. And one way that you never cede sovereignty legally is to keep stating, we're never ceding sovereignty. So then it can never be assumed that that was actually what we were willing to give up in order to coexist. So built around that, sovereignty now becomes, so after Terra Nullius, after the doctrine was actually ruled to be the wrong application in Australia, and therefore the wrong practices that emerged as a consequence of that application has to be reimagined. And we can only do that with a future-looking lens, of which Aboriginal sovereignty is the basis of that future. Because that's the one thing that's been here for 70,000 years. So we've got to, how do we start to have those discussions where it's not always about the colonial? It's not always about a wicked past. It is about the absolute wonder and hope of what it is to be Australian going forward. But instead of saying Aboriginality is just something that's part of a mix, how do we imagine and get proud and confident of saying that really the future is predicated on what has always been? We're just going, because that's what I think is our practice.
Yeah, the recognition of Aboriginal sovereignties, because it's plural, of everyone's, you know, every community's different sovereignties, and then how do individuals not from those communities relate to that sovereignty? How do you form ongoing relationships with the community that you're living in? How do you do that work? Because, you know, that's the work that needs to be done. And I think that people really need to think through these things.
And the hope is to stabilise what it is to be Australian. The Australian narrative is a mess. The Australian identity is a mess. I mean, who was the first Prime Minister of Australia? Edmund Barton. How do we know that? Centenary of Federation. When did we become a nation? Sorry? We didn't become an Australia didn't become a nation state until 1943, when we backdated a declaration of war on one of the axes to 1939 in the Statute of Westminster. Australia at Federation was never supposed to be a nation. We didn't independently become a nation from England until 1986, when we passed a reciprocal legislation called the Australia Acts. So the House of Westminster and here passed the Australia Acts. So we don't understand, when did even we become a freaking nation? Yet we've all got this thing of, we know what it means to be an Australian. You go, but you don't even know when it fucking happened. So how do we start to actually go, Aboriginality becomes central, and Aboriginal sovereignty is the central pillar on what it means to be an Australian now. You might not know why. Any of us who were born before 1992, where in any of our civic institutions, which is education, anywhere, did we get that idea that we're actually in relation? In fact, most civic institutions, particularly our education facilities, denied that there was a relationship because of the application of terra nullius. So we've lived a life on, well, this thing doesn't matter to me because it's not the way I was allowed to construct the world around me. But that time has changed, but in its place. So that's what we talk about with shared futures, which is what is the stabiliser of that as a possibility? Because that was the one thing that was denied in 1788, which is, how do you properly ask Aboriginal people to be here? And that proper asking then would have had different ways that we could know what it means to be Australian, in all its richness, in all its fullness and in all its diversity. But that time is now where we start to say, well, what is the future? And we can only think of it through Aboriginal sovereignty. So Crystal and I and Mary Rose, we try to do it through constructions of logic. Like, this isn't empathy, this isn't emotional. Let's just deal with the facts and let's construct them in a particular way that allows people to emote into it differently. I feel like I'm on a soapbox, but I think I'm going to get into trouble from what happened before.
Another question?
Down the front.
I have a question just regarding what you talked about, centering indigeneity. And as a migrant, I guess a lot of my observations through my work is, and this might be subjective, but many of my observations have been that there is a reluctance around migrants to fully understand Indigenous Australian history, but also engage with it outside of that racialised lens, and in some instances perpetuate those racist ideals and how migrants relate with Indigenous Australians. And I perhaps wanted some of your insights into how some of these communities can work better in dealing and addressing some of that baggage that they might not be aware that they are carrying with them, because that is how modern Australia has been structured, if I'm articulating myself well.
That's probably the most difficult question, but one of the most amazing questions. I will let others have a go first.
Yeah, how do you change communities? I think it is a big question. You know, in terms of the prejudices within my own community, you know, I have discussions with, I have discussions with people, and, you know, so in some ways I think people who are aware of these structures have responsibilities within their own communities to do the educating, because I think that kind of interpersonal relationships often is where change happens, through experience or through communication with someone you trust and love. Because I don't think that people respond very well to wanting to change the way they think with impositions or, you know, yelling and things like that. I think that most often change happens with an experiential thing, or ongoing discussions that people have. In terms of, say, community groups or that sort of thing, I think if people are like willing and want to but don't know how, I would say, you know, to get in contact with the local cooperative or local, traditional owner council, and have discussions and know who your local community groups are, local Aboriginal community groups are, have discussions, have shared events, you know. I've worked at a couple of organisations, and I think people, like, organisations are really open to that, have lots of partnerships with community, like different community groups in their communities, and places around, you know, them, for instance. So, yeah, but if it's an unwilling community group and you're a part of that community group, then, yeah, I think that discussions need to take place. You know, take people to different art exhibitions or plays or other ways of learning, you know, learning about Indigenous Australia.
There's also a whole lot of intellectual work that goes on too, and I think so. It's not. It is at grassroots level. It's about making meaningful engagements between communities, and I think where the refugee, migrant community, and black communities that sit within that matrix, the survival of your own identities is actually under threat. So you can't talk about the Somali community or the Sudanese community without actually understanding, as a racialised group, you are being targeted. So there is particular difficulties in just surviving at the moment as those distinct affirming groups. So how, and there's another way that separate racialised logics actually start to play in and affect the way that we actually can create moments of solidarities, of difference, of blackness in particular. And I think that's because the emergence of... Oh, sorry.
No, go.
The emergence in the literature of migrant communities, and when I say that, black migrant communities, that, oh, we're flashing red here, so we better shut up. But where I think we can create those moments of solidarities is actually start to, what is the logics and what is the sort of the scholarly work that's going on what is the emergent migrant black, and there's refugee contours in that. But what is missing from that is where that blackness is relating to what has always been. And I think taking the African civil rights movement and all of those approaches, which is where the literature exists in volume, because there's not enough literature on that sort of survival of Aboriginality in that kind of complex way. So we need to work across all of those planes to actually solidify solidarity.
And I said really quickly that I think that the relationship between rise and war is a fantastic one. You know, shared support of each other's political movements and political actions, shared recognition of people, of each experience, and that sort of thing. So I think that's fantastic.
We're over time.
Okay.
Cool. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and the world.